Hey, welcome to the Hold the Line podcast. I am here, Sean Feucht. I am sitting in Camp Allah, which is our ministry headquarters here on Capitol Hill. And it's a place that we worship in, we pray in, we minister in, and we have these amazing discussions. And today, I'm actually really excited. Thank you so much, Emma, for coming by. I can't wait to talk about this. Share with us who you are, what you do, really quick so that everybody can know.
I'm a policy analyst with the Heritage Foundation in our Technology Policy Center, but I cover family policy, restorative reproductive medicine, and emerging biotechnologies.
Wow, she's very smart, okay? But also has incredible insight in some of the things we want to talk about today. Part of why I wanted her to share, and I want to have this discussion, well, one, this entire place, this property, the first assignment I really felt like God gave us was to pray. The day that I signed the papers here to come into contract was the day that the Dobbs decision was leaked. And so part of our assignment was, I've been staunchly pro-life. My whole life, I've led pro-life rallies. I've held put the tape around my face. I've had the life band on. It's in all my wedding photography pictures is the life band. So I prayed the prayer that God would reverse the curse, end abortion, and was told my whole life that would never happen. It was too impossible logistically, with legislation, couldn't happen. Public opinion couldn't happen. And then God did it. And thankfully, we were here in DC, and I led I was the first worship leader to lead at the Supreme Court post Roe. So that was one of my greatest. I wrote a song called Imago Dei, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. It's a huge part of who I am as a dad, as a father of four. And so I want to talk about where we're at right now on the pro-life issue. Let's start there. Okay, we saw Roe v. Wade. We saw the unthinkable happen. We're starting to see it filter down into states. Where do you think the battle is now, the fight is now?
Yeah, so we've seen amazing progress with the big, beautiful bill that was recently signed, seeing Planned Parenthood be defunded.
Come on.
Something that I think most of us thought was just unimaginable.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing across the United States, Planned Parenthoods are shutting down left and right, which is a massive win for the pro-life movement. But beyond that, I think you've seen a lot of people really shift into what we would call the pro-family movement more broadly. So just as ever pro-life as possible, I'm working to protect moms and babies across the United States, but shifting it beyond just that and looking at the entire scope of men and women's lives in the United States. So talking about holistic fertility care for millions of Americans who are struggling with infertility, talking about good treatments for reproductive health conditions, and looking at framing a culture, that values children not just as a gift and a blessing when they're wanted, but when they're unwanted. So you'll see a lot of influencers promoting young families with children and really trying to reverse this narrative that children are somehow a burden, and then also promote marriage as a part of that, right? Because marriage is central to these discussions. So I think one of my favorite things has been that shift to a very pro-marriage, man-woman marriage conversation and letting everything else trickle down from that.
Yeah, of course we saw in June, we saw it was like unbelievable. It's like somebody told all the retailers, take away the perversion stuff, focus on family.
Right.
Nike came out yesterday with a pro-life advertisement.
And it was incredible.
It's like,
it
what?
So
like,
awesome.
with the winner of the PGA, you've already won at life with this kid. It really are fascinating days we live in. Now, in the midst of this, there's so much ethical things around IVF, around all that. That was a big hot topic, right? During even the debates and Trump preserving that and all that. Where are we at right now on that issue?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Because I think, frankly, until February of 2024, when the Alabama Supreme Court decision came out related to the accidental and negligent destruction of embryos, I think most Americans either weren't very familiar.
Which that Chief Justice, by the way, is a good friend of mine.
Oh, that's great.
Alabama.
Yeah, that's their whole team is awesome.
Yeah.
They, I think like most Americans, unless you were someone that you knew closely, had struggled with infertility, you probably hadn't really heard or thought about IVF. So when that decision initially came out, you saw all across Washington, D.C., even from very pro-life Republicans, this messaging of I'm pro-life and I'm pro-IVF and I'm pro-woman. And there was this assumption that those three terms were very synonymous and that there was no disagreement between them.
Right.
And so over the last year, I think one of the most interesting shifts that we've seen is the recognition that while every child who is conceived, whether through IVF, natural means, or otherwise, is a gift from the Lord, that there are so many unethical practices within the fertility industry that are underregulated, unaccountable. And if we simply say we're pro IVF, then we are accidentally or incidentally, right, supporting those unethical practices, which include things like a high rate of destruction of embryos. And if you, like me, believe that life begins at conception, then like whether that life begins in a petri dish or in a womb, we should be protecting that life. And then similarly, there is a very common practice of something called pre-implantation genetic testing, which actually allows fertility clinics to test an embryo and then assess the sex of the embryo, potential health outcomes or risks, and even factors. Some clinics and some companies are claiming that they can even test for things like IQ and personality. And so it quickly moves into this field where people aren't simply having a child they deeply desire, but they're paying to have a certain kind of child. And that's where we run into this consumer eugenics that I think is just deeply, deeply unethical in its practice.
Well, and that's the thing that I think is difficult for me. And that's why I'm asking you, because you know a lot about this, is there seems to be no guardrails. And so I sit in this place, and we have many friends that have, had kids or gotten pregnant from IVF, and we celebrate that, and we're excited because they've always wanted to have kids. And of course we tell them adoption's amazing too, but they have a kid, but then there's 6 other embryos. And probably like a lot of Christians out there, what do you do with that?
Yeah, it's such a hard question. One of the really sad things that we've seen in our research and in talking to families is that not only is it pretty common to have leftover embryos, but that leftover embryos tend to correlate with divorce rates too. And this is where you see embryos frozen for decades at a time, because in many instances, couples actually break up, unfortunately, in the process. I think just the emotional pain and difficulty and complications that it introduces. So in some cases, you have these frozen embryos that are left over and the parents aren't even married to begin with, or like they're not married by the end. And so the thing that we say, or the thing that I like to say is first, like we know that every single embryo, even at that earliest stage of development, right, is a human being made in the image of God, right? Like life begins at conception and they have the right to life. And so then second, like, if you are parents, right, who have created embryos, then I think that parents do have this moral responsibility to care for the children that they've created, even if they're still in embryonic form. So there's 2 approaches you can go. One is implantation when you're ovulating in hopes of actually conceiving that child. And then they have something called compassionate transfer, which I think is also ethically complicated, but that's transferring the embryo into the mother's body at a time when it's most likely not to take. So it would just be a very early miscarriage, effectively. But it addresses the question of what do you do when there's leftover embryos. But then beyond that, there's an entire world of embryo adoption. It's similar to adopting a child. If their parents are unable to care for them, couples who have leftover embryos have the option of working with a legitimate embryo adoption agency to hopefully provide their embryos with a chance at life in the home of another family who's struggling to conceive.
So how many embryos are out there?
So our best estimates are there are around 1 million frozen embryos in the United States alone. And some of these embryos have been frozen for 25, 30, 35 years.
That is insane.
We have instances of women adopting abandoned embryos that are older than they are. So 26-year-old women adopting a 27-year-old embryo and having a child.
And the child is...
the child, fine. Right. This is the thing with IVF. There are a number of adverse health outcomes for the mother and the child. And the longer an embryo is frozen, it seems to increase those risks. So for embryos, frozen or not, but embryos created through IVF have higher rates of cancer, congenital heart defects, certain chromosomal issues.
The longer they're frozen, they have more issues?
Yes, but even if you're just created and implanted, you have these issues much higher than the naturally conceived population. Okay. But the longer you're frozen, it seems to correlate with a higher uptick. So there are legitimate health risks and concerns that you have to take into account when you're considering IVF, because in many cases it's your child who's actually bearing the consequences of it.
So is it, how do you, I think a couple questions come to mind when you talk about this topic, how do you, one, implore guardrails, ethical guardrails?
Yeah.
It in your mind, is that part of the goal and part of what you're working on, is trying to find some sort of...
Yeah. So there's a two-pronged approach we take. When it's on IVF in particular, we have done a lot of polling. Others have too on this issue. And by and large, support for IVF is in the 80th to 90th percentile. Everyone wants access to IVF. But what they say, or what they're thinking when they say IVF, is very different than the underregulated industry we have today.
Right.
So there is broad support for limiting the number of embryos created at one time, to ensure that there are fewer leftover embryos once the couple is able to have a child or two, limiting discard rules and regulations. Simply discarding human embryos is actually really unpopular, because people, I think, even implicitly recognize that that embryo is their child, right? Even at that early stage. Limiting the number of embryos implanted at one time, so you reduce the risk of triplets or quadruplets, which then introduces a very complicated discussion on selective reduction.
Right.
But then also really increasing protections for parents, so they have rights when they're undergoing IVF, ensuring embryos are protected as persons, not just as property, because it's typically a property dispute when you're talking about embryos, not a personhood dispute. And then the big one for me is ensuring that things like pre-implantation genetic testing, this eugenic assessment of human life, is not ever on the table. And there are IVF clinics who practice this way, and they actually have success rates just as high, if not higher, than the national average. So Knoxville, Tennessee, at Rejoice Fertility, Dr. John Gordon has an IVF clinic. He's a professing Christian, but he has a very strict rule where he doesn't destroy embryos, he doesn't test them, he works closely with an embryo adoption clinic, and he sits down with the couples and he tries to understand how many kids they ultimately want, what their likely success rates are based on their demographics, and then they create the embryos that will best allow them to have those children, not just creating as many embryos as possible. So regulations wise, that's the approach that we've taken. The goal is to provide IVF in a way that works best with these ethical convictions. But even outside of that, the really big focus that I'm very passionate about is promoting something called restorative reproductive medicine. And so this approach takes a step back and says, what is infertility to begin with?
Right.
And we know that infertility is not just a disease that you get, right? It's not like cancer. Infertility doesn't grow inside of you, but infertility is a symptom of underlying reproductive health conditions. And studies show that when a couple is diagnosed with infertility, they're typically dealing with 4 or more different conditions.
Yeah.
So this is a very complicated diagnosis. So it's endometriosis, it's PCOS, it's male factor infertility. The list, there's like over 100 conditions that actually contribute. And so instead of just jumping to IVF, which actually bypasses your body altogether, what does it look like to actually treat and heal those underlying conditions? And in this field of study, success rates are comparable to, if not better than IVF. And the beauty is that couples' bodies are actually healed so that they're able to naturally conceive as many children as they want. And you don't have any of the ethical abuses and concerns that you do have to deal with the IVF industry.
Well, and it also points to a bigger issue too, which is what drives a lot of this industry. Not everything of this industry, but driving a lot of the industry is the convenience of freezing your eggs and chasing a career and doing it, you know. And it's like, then by the time, well, we still have our eggs over here. Most women, a lot of women are doing that, and so it's like, hold on a sec. Something I try to do is, I mean, I want to get in the nitty gritty of the ethics, and this is an incredible discussion, and we have to continue this at some point, but also promoting the fact that family is God's idea, right? And that we need moms that are willing to see it not as an inconvenience. You know, like my wife, we have 4 kids. Like, it's the greatest joy of her life. Like, it would never be considered. I mean, we just flew on a red eye last night, so we're like, you know, and with the kids and everything. But so maybe don't ask her today. But the point is that that's what we want people to catch on. Right. Exactly. And I think I'm always looking, okay, what is the bigger issue behind all this? Yes, there are couples that can't conceive, and we want that to happen. But for a lot of people, it's a convenience thing.
Right.
They want to play God.
Right. And what's so interesting is that in studies that have been done looking at either states or corporations with full coverage for IVF, meaning you're not having to pay out of pocket for it, they saw that the average age of marriage actually increased because people were putting the idea of children aside and saying, oh, well, I don't have to think about children in my 20s. I don't have to think about children in my 30s. I'll wait till I'm older, till I'm ready to get married, till I'm ready to have kids. But just like you're saying, right, like there's an inherent joy and sense of purpose and meaning embedded in the sacrament and covenant of marriage and in children. And so the unintended consequence of these policies in some cases is that it actually discourages people to get married.
Right.
It discourages children. Right. And it doesn't actually increase the birth rate. So if you're in like the pro-family discussions going, guys, like our birth rate's decreasing, we need to have more babies. Oftentimes people say, well, IVF helps us have more babies. Right. We should have more IVF. But what's so interesting is in every single state and international study we've seen where IVF coverage is implemented, you see younger women slightly less likely to have children, older women slightly more likely, but overall the birth rate remains about the same.
Wow.
So it's fascinating thinking about the way technology is changing the way we view the family. And I think in a lot of cases, the like larger impact is that, it is encouraging us to view the family as a secondary thing rather than of primary importance in our life.
So what would be, I know we got to run here, but what would be your last advice to Christians? Like they're watching this, maybe there's a couple that's like, we've thought about IVF, we've looked into it, it's hard for us to conceive. Like what would be, you knowing all the issues, and I mean, this is your wheelhouse. What would be your encouragement?
My encouragement would be that first and foremost, seek out a trained doctor who can help you diagnose and identify your underlying causes for infertility, and seek the healing and treatment that your body so desperately needs and desires. But don't give up on that progress until you've met with doctors, until you've really pursued that route. Groups like Facts About Fertility or Natural Womanhood or Neo Fertility offer incredible resources to that end. But I think I see so many Christians who are uncomfortable with IVF, but want to have kids and feel like it's a lose-lose situation. And the answer is that it doesn't have to be either of those, right? But that there is hope and there's treatment and healing available if we'll only seek that out.
Wow. Well, this is fascinating. I could keep going. We'll do it again.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Thanks
swinging
so much
by.
for having me on. This is great.
It really is. It's encouraging to know that there's people here on the Hill like you that are diving into these issues, that are passionate about it, and that have really the brilliance and the insight and the ethics on how to navigate it. So God bless everybody out there. We just pray right now from this place. If you're battling infertility or you're battling issues of wanting to have a family, I pray that this encourages you a lot and that you take what she shared, what I've shared, and that God does something to you from this. Amen.
Amen.